Okay. So we can start, I think. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
Perfect.
So can I directly start, or do you want to say something?
Yeah, we can start. So one more time, welcome everybody to this amazing webinar with Manfred Steyer. Manfred, the stage is yours.
So thanks for having me, Tarek. It's always a pleasure, especially because today we will talk about a very cool new feature, perhaps the best new feature we've got in quite a long time. It's about Angular's new standalone components that allow for working without ng modules. And it's also about the question, how will all of this affect my architecture? Because we are taking away ng modules. However, ng modules are used currently, at least for substructuring a huge application into tiny parts. And I want to start with a date, with this date here, October 23rd, 2014. Do you remember what you did back then? Well, I exactly remember, because this was the day where Angular 2 was announced. Back then, it was still called Angular 2, and it was announced in Paris at NG Europe, which was back then the hugest Angular conference on the continent. The hugest conference with support from the Angular team. And there, Igor Mina and Tobias Bosch presented Angular 2 core. And one thing they told us is that we need to rethink old habits, because the web evolved. We had almost ECMAScript 2015 back then. The DOM evolved. We didn't need jQuery anymore, and so on and so forth. So we need to rethink old habits, and this shall influence the architecture of Angular 2. If you are wondering what this picture here is about, well, this is a German proverb. It's called "get rid of old pigtails," which means more or less get rid of old habits, get rid of old stuff. The summary of this presentation contains several dumbstones. And those dumbstones had several terms on it with concepts or pointing to concepts of AngularJS. With this, they wanted to tell us that we don't need any controllers anymore, or any directive description objects, DDOs, or the scope. We don't need this anymore because the web has evolved, as mentioned. Also, there was a dumbstone for jQuery or jQuery Lite. We don't need it anymore because the DOM has evolved. And there is a dumbstone, you see it here, with Angular module. This was also something we thought we won't need anymore, because now ECMAScript has a module system of its own. You know, import, export on top of our files. Some months later, more or less 2 years later, to be more precise, we already had a beta version of Angular 2. And this here is from a workshop I did back then. And you see in this beta version, the router config was connected to the component itself, in this case to the app component. Plus we had this directives array here. In the middle of the component decorator, we had this directives array. And this directives array told us, but also Angular, which directives we are allowed to use in the middle of this template. It's important for us, but it's also important for the compiler to know what's allowed in there and what's not allowed. Saying this, the directives array also pointed to components, because components are just a special kind of directives. Originally, they have been called component directives before they switched over to the term directives. But when looking at this, we also notice two things. The first thing is, it is somehow annoying if we need to mention all the things we want to use in the inside of the template here. And the other thing is, there was already back then the wish for grouping related things like everything belonging to the router. That's why people started creating arrays with all the directives the router provides, directives like router link and router link active and router outlet. This was in Feb 2016. Some months later, however, we got a completely new feature. It was with release candidate 5. With release candidate 5, we get a completely new feature. We've got ng modules, something that was not even intended to be implemented. We got it because we needed somehow a way to define the neighborhood of our components. The neighborhood, or as they call it officially, the compilation context. Everything the compiler allows in the inside of this or that component. And it also solved the issue of grouping related stuff, because now we could easily put stuff that normally goes together into one module. That was kind of nice. Somehow we needed both. However, this came with a big drawback. Namely, suddenly we had two module systems. We had one module system from TypeScript and another module system provided by Angular. And this is a real showstopper for newcomers. It is really increasing the learning curve. And it is annoying for all other people that already know the differences, but they have to write down stuff like this. And since then, the Angular team is investigating ways of getting rid of those app modules again. I still remember it is already 2 years ago, more or less 2 years ago. It was on ngconf 2020. By the way, it was my first remote conference at the beginning of the pandemic. Back then, I told people that after the Ivy compiler, the back then brand new Ivy compiler did its job, there are no ng modules anymore. The compiled code directly knows about its neighborhood, about its compilation context. When Ivy does its job, it assigns a static property to components and to other building blocks. And this static property can have a directive defs array where you put the neighborhood in. All the other components, directives, we are allowed to use. However, this is part of the private API of Angular. And back then I told people now it's just a matter of time until these private aspects are reflected to the public parts of our API. And this time is now. Hey, how cool is that? This time is now. The Angular team is currently working hard on implementing a new idea on top of these Ivy-based capabilities. They will give us standalone components. They will land in Angular 14. They will land in Angular 14 in some weeks, I guess, as a developer preview to get some initial feedback. And after that, the plan for Angular 15, it will become an official feature. To go with standalone components, or to put it in another way, to go without ng modules, everything we need to do is to put standalone to true. Then the component is self-sufficient. Then the component can live on its own, more or less. However, somehow we need to find a way to define the compilation context, and that's why we have this imports array. That means we need to list here the neighborhood of this very component. We can even bootstrap an application of its own. I've just realized this method is now called, let me quickly correct it, bootstrap application. But nevertheless, regardless of the name, it's a cool thing because now we can bootstrap one sole component. We don't need this indirection via an app module anymore, an app module having a bootstrap array. It was always a bit hard to explain in workshops, and it was always a bit hard to understand for attendees. So at first sight, this looks quite straightforward, and honestly, it is really quite straightforward. However, when starting working with this all, at least two questions will come up. Namely, what does this mean for compatibility? And how will all of this influence my architecture? And those are the questions I want to answer today. For this, I've prepared 4 things. I want to get started with the Manfred model behind ng modules, or not ng modules, behind standalone components. If you understand the Manfred model, you will more easily understand the rest. After that, we will talk about compatibility. What shall we do with old code, with existing code? We will also talk about routing. Currently, the router is really tightly connected to ng modules. What will standalone components mean for routing? And then we will go on with the architecture. I'm going to tell you how all of this will influence your architecture in the future. Before we start, let me introduce myself a bit. I am Manfred. I'm a trainer and consultant for Angular, and I'm focusing on Angular in the enterprise, Angular for enterprise scale applications. In this role, I'm doing a lot of workshops and consultancy, on-site, but also remotely. Besides this, I'm quite connected to the Angular community. I live in Austria. I do a lot of stuff in Germany, and I'm always happy if I can work together with people around the world, perhaps on-site or, as mentioned, remotely. So let's get started with the first thing I've prepared for you. Let's get started with the Manfred model. Basically, you can think about a standalone component as about a component with its very own ng module. It's not implemented that way. It's implemented in a more efficient way, but you can think about this when you see a standalone component. That means if you have something like this here, you can switch this out in your thoughts for something like that. A module of its own, a module that only declares your very component. It imports the compilation context, other modules with other directives and components, and it points to your component in question. Here it's the app component. By the way, besides standalone components, we also get standalone pipes, because the idea is to make ng modules optional. And so we also need to find a way to make pipes self-sufficient. And of course, if we have standalone components and standalone pipes, we will also get standalone directives. Also here, we get our standalone property. And if you want to reuse other standalone building blocks inside of your standalone component, just import it. Import your pipe, import your directive, import your child component, and Bob's your uncle. However, when it comes to importing everything, I have one first point from my wish list. Namely, we need to find a way to get auto imports, because, and now I'm jumping one slide back, I don't want to write all of this by hand. Writing all of this by hand is really annoying. I want to have an auto import feature, and I already implemented a prototype for it. Okay, it's a click dummy. It's not a prototype, it's a click dummy. It looks like this here. So let's imagine we are writing something like this into the template of our standalone component. Then something needs to happen. Someone needs to show up we haven't seen in years, namely Clippy. Clippy needs to show up, yes, of course. And Clippy has to ask us, hey, it looks like you want to use ngIf directive and my component. Shall I import it for you? And then I'm saying, yes, of course. And then all those entries are added to my imports array. So this is the idea. Okay, perhaps it will work even without Clippy. I guess we will get the usual notifications in our IDEs, like those blue buttons when it comes to Visual Studio Code, for instance. I'm quite confident that we will get something like this, because the Angular team is discussing this for years. And also the Angular team provides the Angular language service, a piece of software that is included in tons of IDEs like Studio Code or WebStorm, IntelliJ, and so on. And so they can implement it once, and all those IDEs can make use of it. Okay, enough for theory. Let me show you a demonstration for this. In this demonstration, I'm using the current beta version of Angular 14, the version next 15, and obviously this is not intended for production. Don't use beta versions in production. Okay, so let's switch over here to my example. Let's get rid of this. And here we go. Can you still hear me? Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Perfect. So what we have here is a simple application. It is using, of course, Angular material, as you see here, and we have several menu items. And it allows me to search for flags. If we look into the source code of this, then, for instance, we see here an app component, which is indeed a standalone component. Standalone is put to true, and here we are importing our context, our compilation context. Other modules we need, other components we need. For instance, if we look into the shell, here we see I am exporting a navbar component and a sidebar component. I will talk a bit about this programming style and all the advantages and disadvantages in some minutes. Besides this, if we look into our main TS, we see there is a bootstrap application function, and it gets the current app component. That means it bootstraps this app component and draws it to the page. And this really makes everything more straightforward. We have less indirections. We directly point to the components we want to go with. Now, one of those questions I've risen before is, what does that mean for compatibility? Are our investments safe, or do we need to rewrite the whole code? Do we need to throw it away and to write it from the scratch? And here I have a very good answer for you. Everything is up and backwards compatible. It's compatible in both directions. For instance, if you look at your app component here, you see that you can easily import existing source code that is using ng modules. So if you already have this or that library, this or that source code, just import it into your standalone component. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, we can also import standalone components into existing modules. Hence, it's compatible in both directions. Perhaps you are wondering why we need to import a standalone component. Because normally a component is declared. It's a often seen rookie mistake if you import a component and suddenly we need to import it. Well, the thing is, declaring a standalone component would not work on a logical level because a declaration is a very strong whole-part relationship. One component can only belong to one module. And that means that the module is the owner of the component. But this is not the case with standalone components. With standalone components, there is no owner of the component. No, the component is self-sufficient. However, we can reuse the component here and there, and that's why importing it is the right way of doing this. Besides this, if you think back to our Manfred model, standalone component can be seen as a component with its very own ng module. And this also shows that importing this stuff is the right thing to do. By the way, sometimes we also need to get providers from existing modules. And we can define those providers directly when bootstrapping our application. When bootstrapping our application, we can define system-wide providers like my global service, but we could also use this helper function, import providers from, to get providers from pre-existing modules, like the HTTP client module or the router module. This also bridges the gap to another functionality ng modules had before, namely coming up with services or with service providers. Chances are high that in the future we don't need import providers from anymore, because then very likely each and every library will give us a helper function or perhaps just an array with all the providers we need to register here when starting the application. I have another point for my wish list, by the way. We have seen that everything is compatible in both directions. However, we need to update our schematics, because normally schematics search for your app module. They are looking up your main DS and they are looking up the bootstrap module in order to register something there. Another module, something like this. You know, if you look at Angular material, then several material libraries are registered. Or if you look at NGRX, then the store and perhaps even the effects module is registered. Hence, we need to update those schematics, but this should not be that difficult. It should be doable. Okay, let me show you another demonstration or another aspect of our demonstration, to say the least. So in this demonstration, I want to drill in here. And here you see that I'm grabbing providers from several legacy modules or pre-existing modules. They are not legacy. They are only legacy in 1 year, but currently they are not legacy. And you see here, I'm grabbing providers from a configured router module for root. Here I'm passing in my app routes. I'm doing the same with the store module from NGRX and effects module and store DevTools module. As mentioned before, sooner or later, we will get very own convenience functions for all of this, so that we don't need to deal with modules and import providers from anymore. I'm also grabbing some providers from other modules, like one of mine modules or modules we need for Angular material. That's the first point. The second point is I have here a tickets module, and you see this tickets module can totally import an existing standalone component. How cool is that? Also, there is a use case next flight. And as you see here, this use case next flight can import the tickets module. And so one more time, we see that everything is compatible in both directions. Okay, what does all of this mean for routing? You are very likely wondering now, because so far the router was really tightly coupled to ng modules. Routing without ng modules was not really possible before. Well, the thing is, and we've already seen it, we can directly register the routes when bootstrapping our application, at least the main routes. And I've already told you, in the future, we will get even a convenience function that will look about like this. A bit shorter. However, now the big question is, what's with lazy loading? Because the route is also responsible for lazy loading further routes. And for this, I have a good message for you. This routing configuration we are registering can point with load children to another routing configuration. That means we are not pointing to another module. No, we are directly pointing to another routing configuration. And this is really cool because this makes everything more straightforward and it reduces those unnecessary indirections. By the way, there is a new property called load component we can use to load one specific standalone component if we need it. But I think most of the times you don't want to just load one component. Most of the times you will very likely want to group several routes together and load them at once. Another feature we get with the new or updated router is each routing configuration, or to be more precise, each route actually can have a providers array. And in this case, we can register services that are loaded with this routing configuration, given it's lazy, then it's lazily loaded. And the scope of this service is this very route and all children, all child routes. We need this somehow because this was also possible before. You know, before with lazy loading, we loaded another ng module with a routing configuration. And this lazy ng module could also have had an own providers array with some lazy services. And to mimic this behavior, to bring this behavior into the new world of standalone components, we have now this providers array in the middle of our routing configuration. So if you say, hey, I have this or that service, and I only need it for this bunch of routes and child routes, then put it here. If you need the service everywhere, then go with provided in root. The good old provided in root. Candidates for this here is something like ensure X, store module for feature, or a replacement for store module for feature. Something that provides state for this very part of your application. Yeah, and I assume that more and more libraries will also give us convenience functions for this providers array, because we don't want to know which services we need to register for this or that library. Hence, I think this will become a common pattern. They will just export a function or an array we are spreading into this providers array. Okay, let me show also all of this in action. Let's move to our main file. And here in our main file, we see imports providers from blah, blah, blah for root. We are pointing to our app roots, our initial roots. And here you see that we can easily, let me wrap this, that we can easily point to another routing configuration via lazy loading, via load children. We could even load one sole standalone component if you really, really want to do it. But as mentioned, very likely you will want to load a bunch of routes going together. And if I'm drilling in here, I'm pressing now F12. If I'm drilling in here, then this is another routing configuration that can have routes, child routes, but also providers that are only there for this very component and all its children, providers that may provide something for your state library for this very part of the application. With import providers from, or with this or that convenience method or function they will provide. Now the big question is, what does all of this mean for our architecture? Well, the good message is you could just use folders to subdivide your huge application into tiny parts. It's really that lightweight. You could just use folders. You could also go one step further and define barrels per folder. An index.ts, for instance, that is your public API. A public API that defines everything other parts of the application are allowed to use. This brings information hiding to the game, because now you can define what other parts are allowed to use, and everything else is your little tiny secret. And trust me, it's actually a good thing to have little tiny secrets, because everything you keep a secret can be changed easily afterwards. Everything that's not a secret should not be totally changed, because other parts of the system might depend upon it. But if it's your secret, you can throw it away, you can rewrite it, you can buy it from a third-party vendor. It's really up to you. I have another point for my wish list, namely, I also want to use barrels for grouping stuff that goes together. And I want to have a better syntax for importing whole barrels. I want to do something like this. I want to say, well, let's import everything from this barrel, and then let's put this everything into this standalone component. Currently, this is not supported, but the Angular team is already discussing use cases like this. And when we have done all of this, we have achieved one huge goal, namely everything we need are TypeScript import exports. We don't need any ng modules anymore. We just can go with one module system. How cool is that? We can even go one step further. We can even refine it by assigning beautiful names to our paths, to our barrels. We could say, well, let's go with this nice path mapping here. I don't want to write something like dot dot slash dot dot slash dot dot slash index.ts. No, I want to go with those pretty names. And then importing stuff from a barrel is even more straightforward. And then our replacements for ng modules even have a beautiful name, a name where everyone can reason about at first glance. Another demonstration for this. For this, let me switch over to my app component. And here you see my barrel for the shell has a beautiful mapped name. And I'm spreading everything I'm importing here into my standalone component. To make this work currently, I need a workaround. I need a workaround for this imperfect world. Namely, I need to return an array, to export an array with everything I want to group together. The Angular team does not like this. Currently, we need it, but in the future, very likely, at least the Angular team discussed this, all we need is this here. Just export it and then import the whole barrel. In the current beta version, we need to export an array and spread it in here. And by the way, I'm doing something similar with Angular material because I'm tired of repeating myself, of writing down the names of those modules time and again. Not the solution we deserve, but the solution I need to stay sane. The next logical step, however, would be to migrate to something like NX, to an NX workspace. The good message here is that NX can subdivide, very nicely subdivide your overall application into little tiny libraries. Little tiny libraries that don't need any ng modules anymore. However, they give you a lot of additional features like a dependency graph showing you which library is interconnected with which other libraries. That's important to gain an overview, but also to make sure that not everything is intermingled with everything else. You also get another bunch of features like path mappings are generated for you. You get an initial barrel, an empty index.ts, and bypassing the index.ts is prevented by linding. So you cannot say, well, I'm grabbing directly in here into the private area of this module. No, linding will forbid this. Instead, you can enforce people to always directly go via the index.ts. And so you only get what's exported for you. And we get much more features. Features like this here. Yeah, here it is. Features like access restrictions, module boundaries, constraints, as you want to call it. Constraints telling you that not each and every library is allowed to interact with each and every other library. Normally, you want to prevent a situation like this where everything is intermingled with everything else, because in this case, if you change something here, you break something there. And this can be prevented by linding rules shipping with NX. No broken windows anymore. How cool is that? You can even go one step further and use NX to subdivide your whole application into verticals. I call it business domains, like booking, boarding, or shared with shared stuff, and layers. Layers with feature libraries, UI libraries, domain libraries, and utility libraries. A feature library is a library with a smart component or with several smart components. Here we have dump components. Here we have services and entities. And here we have general purpose utility functions like converting dates to strings and vice versa. And this structure is really great. I'm using it with a lot of customers. It has several advantages. One advantage is there is less discussion about where something goes to and where something can be found. Another advantage is we can easily introduce access restrictions, those module boundaries preventing that everything is interconnected with everything else. Here we could say one layer is only allowed to access layers below, and we could say one domain is only allowed to talk to its very own libraries and to shared libraries. Booking can only talk with booking and shared, boarding with boarding and shared. Booking and boarding are not allowed to talk to each other. One more time, this enforces that everything is more or less loosely coupled, and such a matrix is also easy to reason about. It's a nice Manfred model helping you to survive a huge application. Let me show you a demonstration for this. Here in this demonstration, I'm moving over to another implementation of my example. It's actually the same example, but now implemented with NX. Here I have an NX workspace. I have two applications, booking and booking end-to-end for end-to-end testing. And we have several libraries. The libraries are subdivided into business domains. There is one business domain boarding, booking, luggage, and shared with general purpose stuff. And if I drill into booking, we see my layers. There is a domain layer and a feature layer. Just by looking at the prefixes, we know about the layers, domain, feature, and so on. Just by looking at the parent folder, we know about the business domain. So this really shows us where something belongs to. And when drilling in here, we don't see any ng modules anymore. Instead, we go with standalone components. Instead, we are exporting router configurations that may be picked up or lazily loaded by other parts of the system. And the index.ts is more or less the replacement for ng modules. It exports what other parts of the system are allowed to see. Now, if I'm moving up to my booking application, we, for instance, see that my app routes are lazy loading stuff from this feature library. The whole feature library is loaded and we are projecting to the exported routing configuration. This is how stuff goes together. So at the end of the day, we get more overview, plus, and you see it here, we have beautiful names for our libraries. Now let me try to destroy something in my architecture. For this, let me move over to my shared module and to UI shell. Let's go to my navbar. And here, let's try to import something I'm not allowed to import. Let's say I want to import something from an example booking domain, which is ridiculous if you ask me, because this here is a navbar component, a very general purpose component, and it tries to import something from a very use case specific thing, from a booking domain. And immediately I'm getting some squiggles here. And the Linda tells me, hey, Manfred, what do you try to do? You are working inside of the shared part of your application. Navbar component is shared, and you are only allowed to interact with other shared stuff, but not with very use case specific stuff like the booking domain. Don't do it. Don't mess up your architecture. The good message is this also works on the console. So if I'm linting all of this here on the console, ng-lint, how is it called? Shared UI common, I guess. Then the very same error message should occur. Come on, run forest. Okay, shared UI common. How is it really called? UI shell, okay. Yeah, and here we have it. Exactly the same error message. You are in the shared part and you can only interact with other shared part, but not with use case specific part. Don't do it. And I really love this because we can automate stuff like this and we can check against those rules when someone wants to merge their source code against the main branch. And so we can assure that no one breaks our architecture. No broken windows anymore. I really love it. So as you see, libraries in an NX workspace are actually a good replacement for ng modules. They are perhaps the better ng modules, plus they come with a lot of additional features. I have one bonus chapter for you. I want to answer the question how to prepare and to migrate to standalone components, how to prepare for and migrate to standalone components. And there are several strategies. The strategy I'm going to start with is the ostrich strategy. Perhaps you know this ostrich, this silly bird that is just sticking its head into the sand until all the dangerous things are passed by. And yeah, it sounds a bit funny, but this is indeed an option. No one forces you to migrate. No one forces you because everything will be compatible. You can still go on with your ng modules, especially if you have a lot of existing code. You don't need to get in a hurry to migrate it. You can stick with it. However, if you like the idea of ng of standalone components, and if you don't like the idea of ng modules, just remove your ng modules and directly import your compilation context here or there. You can even go one step further and add some barrels, perhaps with path mappings. And of course, if you want to go all in, you should replace ng modules with libraries in an NX monorepo. And then you get all those nice features we've seen before. Actually, it's even more straightforward if you go with libraries in a monorepo. Perhaps nowadays you start with a structure like this here. You have several libraries in your NX monorepo, and all those libraries have modules. They need modules for technical reasons nowadays, because we don't have standalone components. And if you want to access another library, you need to reference its ng module via the public API, via the index.ts. This is how it works nowadays. However, this is really weird because now component 3 is allowed to access component 2, even though there is no directed way to component 2. There is no directed path because this error is pointing in that direction. There is no directed path. However, let's assume tomorrow we get standalone components. Then all you need is throw away your ng modules and it will become more straightforward. You can directly reference what you need. And now you even have a directed path from the consuming component to the consumed component. More logical, more straightforward, more features thanks to NX. Okay, let me come to a conclusion. What did we see today? Well, we saw that the Mandel model of all of this is quite smart. The Mandel model is we can imagine a standalone component as a component with its very own ng module. We've seen that we can structure our stuff with folders and barrels. We can even go with mapped paths, plus using NX and libraries and all those constraints we've seen before are really a win. It's really an improvement for your whole architecture. So consider using them. And last but not least, I need an expert for dumpstones, because now this zombie will be buried again. Somehow Angular modules have been a zombie. They have been called that in 2014, and somehow they are around, still around, but now we can bury them again. So I need someone who corrects my dumpstone here to 2022. And that's it. So thanks for having me, and feel free to come up with all your questions.
So can we ask directly or should we ask in chat?
I think so. Tarek, is it fine to do a Q&A, or do you want to talk about our workshop a bit before we go on?
So yeah, let's do it Q&A. It's definitely. So if you are on Zoom, please ask directly, and all the question on YouTube I will send to Manfred for chat. So let's start with all the question on Zoom, so you can ask directly Manfred, or write a Zoom. It's up to you.
Yeah, cool. Who has a question?
Yeah, you can read the chat first, maybe.
Oh yeah, good idea. Why do we need spread operator here? Yeah, so this is just because of the current beta version. I needed to go with the spread operator. I think already in the next beta version, we can skip it, because normally Angular is flattening nested arrays. But in this beta version, we needed it. Yeah, because it was an array in an array in an array in an array. And Angular is currently not handling it. The next question is, what happens if navbar needs the user model from the authentication domain? Well, if it is just a model class, we can directly import it via TypeScript imports. We didn't even need something special for TypeScript classes, interfaces, and so on in the world of ng module. However, if we wanted to go with a service from the authentication domain, we needed to provide the service somewhere, perhaps when bootstrapping the application or within the routing configuration. And if it was a component, directive, or pipe, we needed to put it into the imports array of this very standalone component. Next question, can we use multiple standalone components inside the same page? Well, currently this is not supported. They really wanted to make this bootstrap application function easy. They really wanted to polish it for the usual use case. And that's why bootstrapping several standalone components on the same page is currently not possible. However, you could go with a traditional app module. In this case, you can use standalone components behind the app module, but for bootstrapping several components on the same page, you needed this app module with the traditional bootstrap logic. So it's really about polishing the API for usual use cases. And normally, we are just bootstrapping one component. Lena is asking how to relearn that we are now allowed to import components. Should we possibly be using a good, better naming convention? Well, currently there are no suggestions by the Angular team. The Angular team told us now let's make it right in terms of the API. And then let's see if there are several patterns that come up in the community. And then perhaps we can do a recommendation for it. I really feel it. Importing components seems to be a bit weird at first sight. However, it will only be weird at the beginning. Because if this evolves, then we won't have any ng modules anymore. Then we might completely get rid of them. Of course, they will be there for reasons of backwards compatibility, but we won't use them anymore. And so we won't see any imported standalone components imported into ng modules anymore. So it's more an issue for the transition. And we will see if the community comes up with naming conventions. Hamed has several questions. First question, can we use multiple standalone components inside the same page? Yeah, we've already discussed this. It's not possible with Bootstrap application. It's possible with the original Bootstrap logic that is still there. Second question, will on-demand loading of components from URLs work with this structure? Yeah, it works as it works nowadays. We can directly import a component. We can lazy load a component and even place it without the router to this or that position on our page. How DI will work? Will be able to inject something outside of Angular to standalone components. Yeah, so as mentioned before, you can define your services when bootstrapping the application, and you can define your services inside of the router configuration. If you need a service for everything, you define it when bootstrapping. If you only need it for a specific part of the application, then you define those services inside of your router configuration. As you said, it's enough to use TS imports, exports, but in the end, we have to reference them inside ng module or ng component. Yeah, that's true. The standalone component has its very own compilation context, this imports array. However, chances are high we will get auto imports for them. And then it will more or less look like as we are used to it in Vue or React. Will this code be shared? Yeah, of course. I will send it to Darek, and I guess Darek will send it out. How is lazy loading for standalone component working now? They are directly imported in TypeScript. Yeah, I think we've also discussed this. You can directly lazy load another routing configuration. So there is a question from Amit. Why use standalone key in the component? Angular can't just check for imports key. Yeah, that's right. That was also a discussion when they came up with the first design document. However, they really wanted to make it explicit. Angular is a very explicit framework. Plus, when we talk about standalone pipes or standalone directives, we don't have an imports array. Also, not each and every standalone component needs an imports array. Chances are high there is one, but no guarantees. And so they wanted to introduce this flag standalone. Arthur is asking how this new architecture style is going to affect the dependency injection hierarchy. So I've played around with it a bit. I think there are two two answers, the simple one and the honest one. The simple one is if you are following patterns the Angular team comes up with, patterns we will teach in the future, then you won't really recognize a huge difference. If you use those patterns, then you can still register services for the whole application, for a part of the application with the routes, or for just a component. However, the real honest question is there are some edge cases in there if we look at this new style of programming, but you should not run into those edge cases if you are aligning with established best practices. Brownie is asking, are we mixing up standalone app and naturally with standalone components? Yeah, this is really done on purpose because, you know, in Angular, an application is a component that consists of components that in turn consist of components. And so the top level component is also the whole application. And yeah, that's why they decided to call this very method bootstrap application. There was a bit of discussion about it. You know, naming is hard, but for the reason mentioned, they decided for the name bootstrap application. Amit, is your DDD plugin or are there services in DDD terms? Oh, let me think what this could mean. Ah, yeah, in your DDD plugin, are features a subdomain? Well, here in this plugin, several features can be grouped to a subdomain. Yeah. Several features and services go together, are grouped to a subdomain having several libraries. Arto is asking, do providers of standalone components become globally scoped and therefore available inside other standalone components? Yeah, this is a very good question. This is actually one of those edge cases I've talked about. So if we register a provider with a standalone component, then it depends a bit. It depends a bit. Let me come up with 2 examples. But I think in general, you don't want to know about this because, yeah, it's a bit complicated and really an edge case. So let's say you have your component. And let's say we have standalone true and providers just with services. This service, that service. In this case, everything is as usual. In this case, we don't have any special things here. However, if you are going with something like import providers from this module, then those providers are hoisted. Then they are not directly associated with the component. And there is a very good reason for this. Because if they are directly associated with the component, they would live and die with the component. Then they would have the same life cycle. However, if service comes from a module, we don't expect it to live and die with this very component, and that's why it's currently hoisted. It's put to a higher level in your hierarchy, somewhere below the application component injector. Perhaps they're also forbidding this. We will see if they will really allow something like this, but in the current implementation, it's hoisted because we need such things on a higher level. We need it to have an own life cycle that is independent of the life cycle of this very component. And that's why I've mentioned before, just wait for best practices and typical patterns and align with them, and then you should get covered. Domin, how would testbed configuration would look like for standalone component? Yeah, the same as currently. You can import a standalone component into the testbed. This is especially a good idea if the component depends upon other services we are also importing into the testbed. If the component does not depend on anything else, we don't need the testbed. At least we don't need to register it with the testbed. Just call testbed.create component, I think that's the name of it, and pass your standalone component. But yeah, if we are talking about components that need a global provider, then import it to the testbed. Also import all the global providers into the testbed and then use it as you are used to it. Magma Rex, why is React more popular than Angular? What's your opinion? I think Angular is much more solid and better for maintaining projects, easier for new people because structure and so on. Yeah, I really feel you. Well, I think it's because React is tinier, more lightweight. That's why it can be used in more situations. Like when you just want to ejectify an existing web page, or if you want to ejectify something that is generated by a content management system. Angular itself is more for full-blown single-page applications. And that's why it's very popular, if you ask me, in the enterprise environment. However, I also see if you just want to do a web page, web design, then Angular might be a bit too much. But I'm not worried about this because for me, for my enterprise story, it's exactly what I need. If we compare it with cars, I think the most popular car is still the VW Golf. But you don't use a VW Golf for everything, and not everyone buys a VW Golf. Sometimes I need a truck. Sometimes I need a van. Sometimes I even need another vehicle. And so it really depends upon what I need in my situation and not upon what is the most popular approach or product. Have you seen any build size improvements with standalone components? Have the Angular team made some gains here when switching to standalone components? Not really. The bundle size should be about the same. However, there are some experiments some community members did, also with the scan pattern, and they found out that getting rid of ng modules might accelerate your build tasks. But I don't have any current numbers on this. Okay, that's it. Are there any further questions?
I have one question about how to, is there any best practice already about the, I would say, embedded directives or something like that? For example, in the material table, you have several directives you have to use for columns and so on. So in the currently you have one module that will provide all these directives to you. and in the future I have to import them all independently, or use something like the array you showed for all the material modules? Is there some drawback when using this array structure?
Yeah, so the Angular team does not like it because it is like a lightweight ng module. An ng module is also nothing else than a bunch of arrays. I see two possibilities here. One possibility is it won't be an issue at all because we get auto imports. And another possibility is the Angular team is discussing ways of importing whole barrels where we are just exporting stuff that goes together. And then we won't need any array. We just export everything that goes together and import the whole barrel at once.
Okay. How can you import the whole barrel? You're using this import asterisk as syntax?
Yeah.
Ah, okay. Okay. Thanks.
Very welcome. Are there any other questions?
Hi, Manfred.
Hi.
I would like to ask about how this will work with module federation. It will be compatible? Is it expected or?
Yeah. So I've already have a first blog article on this and the first example, and it really works perfectly because module federation does not even care what you are exposing. That means you could directly expose standalone components, but I think you will more likely expose router configurations that are lazily loaded into your host application.
So this will improve the way that micro frontends work at this moment, no?
Yeah, I would not say really improve, but it also makes micro frontends and plugin systems a bit more lightweight. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Very welcome. Are there any other questions?
Okay, if there is no other questions, Manfred, please share us the web page with our course.
Of course.
So we can go through all the points, what people can expect.
Yeah, with pleasure. So Angular
master.dev.
Master.dev. Yeah, thank you. So this is this guy that will do the workshop. And here we have an agenda somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, in this course, by the way, it's a video course. That means you can learn when you want and what you want and focus on your topics you really like. You get new videos on a regular basis, I think once a week or something like this. Plus, at the end of the week, we have office hours. Something like this session today, where we can discuss your questions, your ideas, your concerns, where you can even challenge the theory. And yeah, this here is the agenda. We get started with strategic design, which is quite a nice approach for subdividing a huge application into tiny parts that don't know much about each other. This allows us to decouple our parts. This allows us to evolve parts without influencing and breaking other parts. Strategic design is an idea. It's a thought model. And we will implement it with an NX monorepo. We will see how we can visualize our architecture with the dependency graph. We will see how we can categorize different libraries to make it easier to reason about them. We will also learn and also see in the exercises how to enforce our architectural specifications. how to force people into following something like an architectural matrix or an hypercube. We talk about incremental builds. That means we don't want to build everything time and again. Instead, we just want to rebuild and retest stuff that has been changed. Also a feature of NX. And also this here correlates with it. This is the distributed build cache that caches everything we've done so far so that we don't never ever need to rebuild stuff we've already built. We will have a deep look into module federation. It's one of my main topics. We use it to provide micro frontends that can be developed and published separately. This is the key for autonomous teams, for scaling huge applications. We will also talk about an integration in Angular and the Angular CLI. In terms of module federation, we will talk about very dynamic federation scenarios and sharing dependencies, also about dealing with version conflicts and communication between micro frontends. We will share widgets via web components, and we will also talk a lot about optional modules and standalone components. All my examples are also migrated to this new style, so we can compare it. By the way, this is one of the new things. I have a very nice new approach for making authentication more secure and more easier, thanks to reverse proxies and security gateways. I know the sentence sounds like the sentence from a car merchant. It is more secure and easier, but it's really true. With this approach, once we've grasped it, authentication is really a piece of cake. And we will talk about building a Frankenstein solution, which is a very special kind of a micro frontend where we are combining different frameworks and versions. There are also some bonus stuff we've already recorded, like how all of this fits into NGRX. Of course, this is not an introduction into NGRX, but we need to talk about how all those topics go together with NGRX, how our architecture works when we want to include NGRX, best practices, authentication, and of course, Ivy, which is the enabler for standalone components. Also OAuth 2.1, which correlates with the idea of the security gateway. Yeah, so that's it for our 2022 edition. And if you like it, just book the course. I think the price is quite nice. And also I like this style of learning because it gives every one of us a lot of freedom. And nevertheless, we have one contact point per week where we can discuss everything that comes into mind.
Yeah, exactly. So that's how Manfred said. This meeting is inauguration of the opening of the second edition of our program, the Angular Architecture Strategic Design with NX edition 22. So you can join this program from today to 18th of May. So only this week, we have the rule that we open the program once a year for a week, so you can join, and then we work together on this material the next month or two. So because this is a second edition, all the material you get when you join the course, but all the Q&A session is belong to some next step, some steps of this program. So you have the video in this program, you have all the materials, all the code, and you have the online Q&A session with Manfred. Yeah, so if you have any question about the course, this is the good moment to ask. Yeah. If everything is clear, I will very thank you to be with us today. Thank you, Manfred, for this great workshop, as always.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And yeah, and we see on the other side in the course.
Cool. See you there. Have a nice day.
There. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.